Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sisters of hers would, in the aftertime, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all her riper years, the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. Hello friends, and welcome to my channel. My name is Haley and I am a Christian wife, homeschooling mother of 3, out to redeem my very own literary education, which means for the very first time in my adulthood, after public school and 4 years at university, I am reading so many classics, specifically childhood classics, for the very first time. And for middle grade March, I am reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. And I am reading this for the prompt of travel. Now, this maybe isn't necessarily travel, but I consider going down the rabbit hole into Wonderland a beautiful form of travel. But this is my very first time reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and it was such a delight. I read this aloud with my 6-year-old daughter, and she loved it. I thought it was very interesting to see 2 people with very different perspectives and seasons of life take in this story. Me as an adult, a grown-up, and a mother, and her as a child who still understands all the sense of wonder and enchantment and just taking things as they are without having to know what they are. And that is the beauty of childhood. That is the beauty of this book, particularly reading it as an adult. So trying to recall the story of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland really is almost like trying to recall a dream you just had last night. You can see sort of these pictures and snippets of what happened, but really trying to piece it together and put some meaning and understanding behind it is just beyond you, and that is what this story is. So at the beginning of the story, we find Alice, a young girl, laying on her older sister's lap as she is being read to, not a picture book, so it must have been a very boring story. And she finds herself distracted by a little white rabbit wearing a waistcoat who is screaming that he's late. So what's a curious young girl to do? Follow the rabbit, of course, down the rabbit hole and into the land of Wonderland, where she meets all sorts of talking creatures on curious adventures, things that don't really seem to make sense, but Alice herself speaks to herself and can logic and reason all of these things out with her own childlike brain. It was phenomenal and so much fun. And it also kind of has the sense of a dream. So I think a lot of people would call this book nonsense. And in some ways that might be true. However, this book I felt like approached it with a very dreamlike sense. So these things may not make sense if they were happening in the real world, but while you're within the dream, while you're within Wonderland, it just makes perfect sense. And some things I found interesting and endearing about Alice is that she talks to herself and reasons these things out for her own. But what I also loved about this book is she as a child encounters all of these things in Wonderland that her little ears have heard on the outside grown-ups speak about. Now she herself may have no idea what these things really are, and as a grown-up I could certainly tell that she didn't. But these scenarios are created in Wonderland that are very lifelike and realistic. One I can think of is the encounter of the mock turtle. Now, when we think of a mock turtle, you might think of mock turtle soup. Now, I certainly don't know what that is as an adult, and I don't think Alice did either, but she encounters a mock turtle who is simply just a turtle who is very depressed and crying, and we can't really figure out the reason why. But there's a lot of sensical yet nonsensical things that happen in this book like that, and so it was just a lot of fun. My daughter laughed. She thought it was hilarious. I was often confused as an adult, but it was just kind of fun and delightful, even if it didn't make sense to me. And after completing this book, I asked her what her favorite part was and what her least favorite part was. Her favorite part was Alice encountering the white rabbit and the white rabbit asking her for his gloves. And her least favorite part was, of course, the screaming, tyrannical Queen of Hearts, who I actually just thought was hilarious, and it was one of my favorite parts and favorite sections of the book. But it was fun that in her sort of 6-year-old brain, that was also terrible to her. I also found it very fun that in Wonderland, Alice changes sizes throughout the book. So she's constantly making herself large, making herself small, and things kind of happen around her size. That's really funny. But I just loved this book. It might seem nonsensical, but there were a lot of truths as an adult that I got out of it. So often these creatures that she meets that can talk, like the griffin and other creatures, are asking her to recite poetry. Now, as a Charlotte Mason homeschooling mother, recitation and poetry is a part of my children's homeschool education. But what I learned from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is that I don't want to indoctrinate my child with poetry to the point of just perfect recitation, that I want it to be delightful. I don't want my child to have a fear of commanding that poem in such a perfect form, but to enjoy poetry. There were a lot of other little things like that in this book that felt like commentary on school for children, and it just being a bore, or they're being scared into recall these facts, and that's just not something I want to give to my children in their homeschool education. So I, as a mother, got that out of this book, and it was really fun. But my favorite part in this entire book is in its ending. When Alice sort of wakes up, her sister wakes her up, and then she narrates her dream to her sister and then walks away. But her older sister is kind of sitting there, and then she kind of starts to recall Wonderland herself just based off of Alice's tale, and she can picture all of these little moments that her sister recalled as if they were real. And then she kind of wakes up from her daydream and ponders on that very last paragraph, which I read at the beginning of this video. How, you know what, Alice as a child with this such vivid imagination will hopefully in her later years retain that, pass that on to other children, and remember these wonderful happy days of childhood. That is what this book is about. And so encountering this story as an adult for the first time kind of awakened that in me and wanted me to be more attuned to my own children's sense of wonder and enchantment and imagination, and be encouraging to that and not discouraging to that. So this is a book I certainly have to read again to remember everything that happened, because like I said, it felt like a dream while I was reading it, and even after reading it, and I just can't seem to recall everything that happened, but I know it was fun, and I know it was funny, and I know it was interesting, and I would like to read this again, and I know my daughter would too, because she absolutely loved this book and could not wait to read it every single night before bed. So if you have never read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, and you've only ever watched the Disney movie, please read the book, because of course it is so much better and so much more fun. And if you have little ones, read this with them, because it's going to be fun and funny to see your reaction to things that you understand as an adult, and just see how your children will take it, because they probably don't know what it means, just like Alice doesn't really. And it's just fun. If you've read this before, please let me know in the comments if you love it, or if you plan on reading it if you haven't. And that is all I have for you, friends. Lord willing, I will see y'all next time. Happy reading!